All right, thank you everybody for coming. We're gonna get started. Today we're gonna be talking about some tools for the modern web developer. I'm Sam Metnair. I work in professional services division of Esri. I spend a lot of time doing web development.
And hi, I'm Nathan. I do web development as well, full stack, and I work at the DC office also for professional services. So starting off, I just want to set some goals and tips for this presentation and kind of a starting point. We want to kind of give a survey for finding new tools here, just learn where to start, and on this journey we'll explore some new tools and technologies, provide a starting place for discussion. Don't feel pressured to write everything down today. This is more of a survey of everything, so you can download the slides afterwards and then dig into these more as you wish.
Yeah, and really to emphasize the point, this is purely a starting place. We're not going to get too far into any of the actual implementation or usage of these tools, but we're really just hoping to provide a thread that you can pull at. Maybe something looks useful. This is a place for you to discover that and then on your own time figure out how that might actually work with some of your existing stacks or projects that you've been working on. And so to kind of start out the presentation, we're actually just going to kind of start the same way we start with a new web application, and that is actually just setting up a new application. So if you've done this before, maybe then just some of the past couple of years, Webpack was a very common bundler tool that you could use as your build tool that you could use to get started with your application. And then there were tools kind of like Create React App, which use Webpack behind the scenes, but create kind of an environment that you can get started pretty quickly with the new application. And I'm here to tell you that those are not the tools that you should be using anymore, because now the more kind of modern competitor is now Vite. And Vite is relatively a newer tool. It's been in kind of a stable phase for probably about a year or two at this point. And if you have no idea what Vite is or even what Webpack is, these are essentially the tools that are running the base of our web application project. So when we're working locally with web applications, we need something like Vite. This is basically our way of allowing us to use things like TypeScript or a framework. Vite is essentially doing some of that like pre-processing, and then it's also managing some of the bundling if we're using any third-party libraries. And so the reason Vite is so much better than some of its predecessors is that it works with ES module, and it also works with TypeScript out of the box. So it provides a lot of very useful things out of the box, which also will actually significantly increase the amount of time it takes for Vite to bundle your package. So personally, I used to have a project where I used Webpack, and the first startup time was around 60 seconds. And after transitioning to Vite, we were able to get that startup time to around 5 seconds. And that's just because of the way that Vite works behind the scenes. It actually does a lot of pre-bundling, which is just basically an optimization on top of what things like Webpack did. And then outside of that, it also just provides a lot of good resources for getting started with a web project. And one of those resources is actually some of their template applications that they provide. And so this is actually a good way for us to discover some of the main tools that they're recommending we use. And so we'll actually kind of break down some of the tools that they're recommending at this point. So there's a lot on this screen. We'll kind of break it down bit by bit. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the package manager side of things. And if you're familiar with a package manager, you're probably already familiar with NPM. NPM is kind of the most common package manager, and it also acts actually as there's actually a whole hosted place online where anyone can kind of update their own packages and upload to this common repository that then other developers can pull down into their local development environment. So if you've ever used something like ArcGIS Core, you're pulling that in through the NPM repository. That being said, NPM has a kind of few alternatives that use some of the same technology under the hood, but are built on top of NPM, are built in a similar way to NPM. They're still using that same repository, but they've kind of implemented some better developer experience or optimizations to make it faster. And so one alternative is Yarn. At one point, this was a very popular alternative to NPM, but since then, some of the other newer package managers are actually maybe just better alternatives. So we're not going to get too far into Yarn. And one of those kind of more modern alternatives is PNPM. And this is basically, as obviously, it uses that NPM. It adds a P, very unique. But really the main benefit of something like PNPM, there's actually kind of two main benefits. So when you're using NPM and you clone a package, it's pulling it directly into your repository, whereas PNPM tries to solve, where the issue with that comes is if you have many repositories on your computer, those are all downloading individual dependencies. PNPM actually implements a way of having a centralized place on your machine that all of your different repositories or all of your different projects can point at the same downloaded dependencies. And so it reduces a lot of overhead of copying these packages into multiple projects, which also incidentally makes it much faster. And then a bunch of other under the hood optimizations. At the end of the day, PNPM on average testing of cloning packages to your repository can be up to 2 times faster than NPM, which if you have a lot of packages on in your repository, that can be a pretty significant change in time. So PNPM is definitely kind of one of the newcomers, but definitely for a good reason, because it's very efficient and fast. Finally, we have Bun, which is a little bit harder to explain because it actually not only is a package manager, but it's actually also replacing the underlying technology that NPM, Yarn, and PNPM are using with a fully custom implementation. So the other 3 package managers, they're using Node.js under the hood, whereas Bun is actually trying to replace both Node.js and the package managing experience. And they have some very promising results. It also tends to be much faster than some of these existing solutions. And if you're not familiar with Node.js, that's essentially what we're using to run this local development environment. And Bun is basically just an improvement on that. The one thing to note, though, is Bun, while it did come out in a 1.0 release, it still does not quite replicate everything that Node does nowadays. So this is very much one to keep an eye on, but it might not fit the needs for your project at the current time. So that definitely is the winner for the most intriguing, the winner for most kind of universal, and basically recommended is just NPM. If you work on any project, there's a 90% chance you're already using NPM. This is what comes pre-installed with Node.js. So this is essentially the most common, but just because it's common doesn't mean it's good. And that's where PNPM is really shining. It really just takes what NPM does and tries to improve on all aspects of not only the speed side of things, but even the developer experience side of things. So If I had to recommend one to check out, it would be PNPM. It's a pretty interesting tool.
Moving on from that, next we want to look at languages. So the big question often is JavaScript or TypeScript. There's a lot to unpack here and a lot of debate and things, but the main difference is that with JS, you're going to be, it's going to be easier to write, and it ends up making things a lot harder sometimes in the end, especially if you're running a large project. So TypeScript does have its challenges and can be a little annoying to set up, but it will, with type safety and other features, in the long run, if you're running a large project, it will prevent future runtime bugs. Also is helpful for documentation. Just having a large team, it will document the code better for sharing as far as types and things like that. So the takeaway here at a high level is if you're new to development and it's a small project, feel free to use JavaScript. But if you're writing a larger application for production, have a larger team, having the type safety and the documentation available through TypeScript is optimal.
Yeah, and so our general recommendation is if you can't really pick one, just get started with TypeScript. It definitely adds a little bit of overhead to your projects of having to explicitly define types, and then you might also lose some flexibility. If you've ever used JavaScript, you can be very flexible with the way you interact with some things like objects and arrays and just even primitives like numbers. But the biggest benefit of TypeScript is, again, just that static runtime validation. It leads to catching bugs that without the types being defined could be much harder to identify, and it allows you to fix those bugs while you're in the code rather than when something breaks in your application. And so we would definitely recommend just kind of getting started with TypeScript. Another nice thing is you can use as much or as little as you want. The configuration is pretty flexible, so if you want to have it to define functions, it's really, you can have it for that, but then say you don't like using it within components in your framework, you can really configure it so it's really flexible and just make it so it works the way that you want it to. So there's not a ton of downside of just adding it and using it bare bones or fully going in and using it in everything you make. So we would definitely recommend checking it out if you're not familiar with it, or reconsidering it if you've written it off at some point. So, yeah.
Finally, once we've selected those, we want to talk about frameworks, just the basis for your web application, how to organize it. Frameworks are helpful for state management, things like that. So we have a list here, and we'd like to run through some of them. Starting off, there's just vanilla TypeScript. So using the base language, coding everything from scratch, you don't really get anything out of the box. It's on you to maintain state and things like that. So that's an option, but it can be complex and can take some time. You don't get the benefits of working with some pre-made code.
Yeah, and then looking at one of the other options, and again, these are all kind of the Vite, the starters that they provide, and so we kind of want to just break it down by each of these tools. So one of the other starters they provide is using a more of a library called Lit, and the purpose of this library is to take advantage of the standardized web components APIs that the browser provides. And somewhere you've probably heard web components is in things like the plenary or hearing about the Maps SDK team. They are starting to utilize web components for the Maps SDK for JavaScript to provide an easier configuring experience or an easier way to interact with things like widgets in the browser. So Lit is essentially a tool that will allow you to take advantage of the same technology. And a really big benefit of doing this is if you're creating component libraries, so for example, the web map components, these are components that then anyone can pull into their projects, kind of regardless of framework, just because it's built in to the standard specifications in your browser. So it's a pretty universal, pretty universal components, or you can make some universal components, which just makes it easier to work with components in different frameworks.
Moving on, we have what we would consider React-like frameworks, but improvements on them. So they are similar to React in some aspects, but they were designed to solve some shortcoming that React has. So they're more efficient, or they solve some of the existing React challenges around better state management, automatic optimizations, and server-side rendering integrations and API integrations. Unfortunately, when you use these, they're new and upcoming. They haven't been used as much, so you do lose some of the community support that's behind React, but they do have some support there.
Yeah, and these are, just to emphasize that, these are tools that are very promising and look like they will have a lot of potential. But the issue with a lot of these tools in the JavaScript ecosystem is that they are constantly kind of changing or trying to fit the needs of the latest needs. So they can either tend to be unstable, or they might have more frequent major updates, which when you're working on a large scale project, that's not always something. Sometimes you need a little bit more of a stable foundation to work on. And that's kind of like this middle ground that we'll look at is frameworks like Vue and Svelte. So these are the cool kids on the block. Everyone wants to use them, and they just make a lot of complex things much more simple. And so Vue has been around a good amount longer than Svelte, but they both basically try to provide this way of kind of an alternative to things like React. They have their very much own syntax and ways of interacting with creating components, and a lot of that has to actually do with the fact that, especially Svelte, they're compiler first, or they were designed with the compiler in mind, and so with some of the other kind of older frameworks, it wasn't always as common to design it with the idea that you're running it through something like Vite, or running it through some preprocessor to transform the code. But like tools like Svelte have taken full advantage of that, which also means that they can end up being much better optimized than some tools like React or Angular. And so finally, we'll actually just look at React. And React is kind of considered old reliable. And that really just comes down to when you look at the community support behind it and the number of usage, or the number of people using it, the time it's been around. It is just in a phase where it is very matured and well known. So it's like a very solid foundation of where you could get started. The issue is then, again, since it has been around for so long, it might run into many issues that many of these other new frameworks have solved. So there's definitely a trade-off of being able to interact with a large community, but again, you might have some trade-offs of that it's much more mature and not as kind of innovative. So, but luckily with React, they are still making updates. There's another update planned for later this year. So it definitely is still a viable option, and definitely still a fine choice for getting started. So really the point that we're trying to make here is there really are different needs for all of these different frameworks. And so it's a very subjective choice. It's sometimes a very opinionated choice. I know I can be swayed to just use React because I know it well, and there's something to that. If you're familiar with the framework and you know how to use it well, even though there might be a new shiny framework, sometimes it's better to use what you know and build upon that solid foundation rather than trying to kind of switch context and build something you're not familiar with. And you might actually end up building it in a worse way just because you've never really used it. So that is to say, looking at the differences between all these frameworks, there's kind of a lot of different choices you need to make here, and just stick with the choice you make and make the best of it rather than constantly trying to chase the newest technology.
So next, if our tool chain so far looks like this, if we're selecting those, so we have Vite and React and TypeScript. So we take those together, and then there's StackBlitz, and this is where, if you go to this URL here, this would set up using Vite and React and TypeScript a project in StackBlitz. StackBlitz is an online code editor. It's the power of VS Code, essentially, but in the web browser. And it gives you a VS Code-like experience, all kept within a browser tab. So you don't have all the local files and all that. You can get stood up pretty quickly. It uses a technology called web containers. So I'm sure you're all familiar with containers in general, but web containers are run in the web browser tab, and they're written using WebAssembly, and it uses a WebAssembly-based operating system. And that allows it to boot in within your tab within seconds, and it is able to securely run an entire development environment, stand it up instantly.
And yeah, so a big benefit is being able to develop your project all within the browser. But in the case that we want to do it locally, Vite also basically allows us to, we can actually utilize NPM, and Vite exposes this create package services for each of these different templates we were looking at. And so in our case, we'll create it with the React TS starter and open up in our VS Code. If you haven't heard of VS Code, I'm not really sure what editor you're using at this point because it seems like everyone is using it. So definitely worth checking out if you've never heard of it. It basically is just a way for us to interact with our projects and edit our code locally. There is also a maybe lesser known, maybe for good reasons, vscode.dev website. And this is actually a way of using VS Code in the web. But as Nathan was saying, StackBlitz is a really great way because it uses things like web containers, which is a way to have a local or a development environment in the web. VS Code in the web doesn't quite have the same kind of technologies. And so it's more useful for things like PRs or pull requests. If you need to review someone's code quickly, you could quickly open it in the web. But the gist of it is that StackBlitz kind of outpaces it in terms of what the editing experience and the actual development experience is like. So we definitely still recommend using StackBlitz instead.
Next up after that, we wanted to bring up a challenger, what we consider a challenger to VS Code. There's a new IDE out there called Zed. It's an open source editor. It's created by the creators of the Atom text editor. But we consider it a challenger up and coming to VS Code. It's a high performant editor, so it's considered multiplayer is how they refer to it. So it's collaboration first. What it's doing is it's taking some technologies like GPU rendering and CPU rendering, and it's written in Rust for performance, and it rasterizes your whole window so that you have a lightning fast interface and display of things. This results in lower insertion, latency, It reduces startup time compared to other editors, as well as has a smaller memory footprint. It's collaborative first. So when you take your project, you can add it to a coworker's project, and you can browse that project like it's on your desktop. So you can think of this as kind of like a Google Sheets or Google Docs approach, where you'll see the mouse pointer and you can move around and edit and work on a project together in real time. And that's why some of the performance is important, is to get that cursor moving. You can kind of think of a video game where multiplayer, where it needs that performance to get the editing to be smooth between them. It's also AI focused, so it supports Copilot out of the box. And so it has all of that available. One detraction from it is that the extensibility isn't quite there yet. Visual Studio Code has a lot more extensions, but it's coming along. And it's also currently only available for macOS, but the team is working on extending it and making it more portable. Moving on, I'm sure everyone's heard of it, but AI coding assistants are really up and coming. They're used a lot now by a lot of people, I think. We'd like to take a look at GitHub Copilot. It's a coding assistant based on a large language model that you can add plugins into VS Code and other editors. And it provides coding recommendations, fixes, things like that. So as you can see in this example here, we've created a function add to add two numbers, but we have an error in the code. We're instead subtracting. So when we run this, we get the unexpected output, but the output that we get, we're not sure why. Say it's a larger method and we haven't debugged it. So we're able to select all that code and ask Copilot, fix this function. And what the Copilot will do is it will go in there and it will figure out what was wrong and why it's not performing as expected and provide a suggestion. And then we can either accept or discard that suggestion. And so in this case, it did find that we were subtracting instead of adding, and we can accept that suggestion there. Finally, the Copilot plugin for VS Code does have support for context as well. So if you open the Copilot in VS Code, you are able to scope context. So you can put at VS Code at the start and type a question, and it will scope your question to the context of the VS Code application. And so you can ask it any type of question regarding VS Code. In this example here, we asked it, how do I enable linting? And it correctly came back and gave instructions on how to enable linting in VS Code. Another context you can ask is, that you can specify is at workspace. And so you can say, anything in my workspace I want you to take into account when answering questions.
Yeah, and moving on from there, we even have a browser recommendation. And usually you probably wouldn't see that in here, but it is especially useful for working on many projects at once. It is called Arc Browser. It is not an ArcGIS product, has nothing to do with ArcGIS. It just happens to use the Arc name. So you can, with my demonstration here, say this is what your browser usually looks like. You have a ton of tabs open. And in this case, let's pretend each of these colors is kind of a different project you're working on. And so you can see we have all these tabs. You're context switching. You have all the tabs just kind of intermingled. And so what Arc actually does is it provides a very easy way to organize tabs based on things like projects. And so you can see here, now this is my red space. So this is whenever I'm working on my red project, this is kind of an easy way for us to define maybe bookmarks that we can come back to later, or even just the current tabs that we have open in while we're working on this project. And you can see on the bottom here, we kind of have 3 buttons. So say I click on the green one, that brings me to the green tab. That's a completely different isolated space from this red space. And so it's a really good way of actually organizing tabs. And just like a quick example, It's probably not super easy to see on the screen, but this is my Dev Summit tab or space that I have on my browser. And so this just helps me kind of keep all of my Dev Summit links in one place rather than having 100 tabs open on my top bar in Chrome or something. So it's really nice for organization. And the organization is only one piece of it. There are just a ton of other features that make it just really easy to use. And the team has just been adding new features very consistently, even weekly. And it's just a very kind of new way of thinking of how browsers should work for us and how much they can actually do to help improve some of our workflows. So would definitely recommend checking it out. Unfortunately, this is only on Mac, but they have a Windows beta, so it's coming for Windows soon, but definitely something worth checking out. Finally, in this kind of like starting section of getting our initial tools, we have Astro, and this is actually a web framework that is it's very agnostic of what tools you're actually using within it, and so basically the purpose of a web framework is to provide an easy way for us to do things like structuring our website, so things like routing. It also takes care of a lot of like content collections, and so for the case with Astro, Astro is essentially the skeleton of your application, but then the actual implementation of each component and page, you can use React or Svelte or Vue, pretty much any of the things we talked about earlier. And Astro is really the thing that tries to hold it all together. The thing is, with a web framework, you never actually really need one, but it just provides many kind of tools out of the box. And so this is kind of an optional tool. And another issue is historically these web frameworks are very server first. And if you've ever worked with the Maps SDK, we actually have a lot of client-side interactions. So these server first frameworks don't always feel like they fit the needs of some of our more client-side single-page applications. So, but if you're making something like a blog or maybe documentation, Astro just provides a really nice framework for getting started with that kind of thing. So it also just has a bunch of integrations that make it very easy to integrate tools you're probably already using automatically, which is very nice. So definitely something worth checking out. Yeah, and so now let's actually add some tools to our code rather than the things that we're using to develop.
Yeah, so first we'd like to add some tools into our processes now. So we have up first, we want to look at linting. So ESLint, rules for writing consistent and quality code. So we can write these and run the linter, and it will fail or give us warnings for different code snippets. We can add rules. There's a lot of built-in ones. There's also developer-defined ones that we can add, as well as community ones that are available. And it helps your team write consistent code that meets standards and best practices. So as here you can see, it's using a for each to iterate over the array, and you can specify a rule to prefer for of, and it will highlight that and let you know when you don't.
Yeah, and so it's essentially just a way for your team to enforce consistent standards, and this is a very opinionated rule, but it very much comes down to your team and the kind of standards that you want to set for your team.
Yeah, and so here again, just another example, and it's suggesting a way to improve your regexes. And so in this example here, it recognizes that the regexes overly verbose here, and that it would be a better rule to specify, instead of specifying digits 0 through 9, specify \D. And so it has found that, and it failed the other one, and is very opinionated in suggesting a different regex to meet the needs. Moving on from that, formatting of code is important, especially for the readability of teams when you're working with a lot of people. And there's various opinions on this. Some people are very opinionated and have trouble working with anything formatted differently from how they like it. But it's important for a team to have the code at least in a consistent format that's readable. And so first up, we'd like to look at Prettier. And it's just mainly about keeping everything indented and formatted correctly so that it's easily readable. As you can see here, after we run Prettier, it indents the code and makes it shorter so you can view the lines easier. And here's an example of it, just the before and after. You have this code that runs a long line, and it's shortened it so it's easier to read, especially if you have a lot of code. And it just helps your team stay consistent with the formatting. The code's been formatted there for vertically for readability. It's opinionated, so you might not agree with it, but it's helpful for a team to have those stylistic decisions enforced. So one of the challenges with linting and these is that you end up with a lot of plugins. So you have all these rules and you keep on adding more and more plugins. It's great because it's super extensible. You can get what you want, but sometimes it's almost too much because you have all these plugins that you need to add, and it can become complex to add the right packages and maintain those.
Yeah, and so now a newer linter and formatter has come to the scene, and it actually, instead of how ESLint does linting and Prettier does formatting, Biome actually tries to combine the two into one, and it's also significantly faster than either of the two technologies. But really the main benefit of using something like Biome is that it's bringing these two things into one, and it just means there's fewer technologies you need to integrate, and it's a much easier kind of plug and play for your project. So you can also see it provides more than 190 rules out of the box. So that's kind of like the rules that we were looking at before. It provides a lot of if you can read the white outline on the right, it provides all different kind of categories of rules that will just help you write better code. And so like looking at some of the actual benchmarking that's been done, it is 25 times faster than Prettier, or it's also 15 times faster than ESLint. And while that might even if it was like 2 or 3 times faster, it's still a much needed significant improvement. And maybe you can guess that it's written in Rust. That's kind of the theme with a lot of some of the more recent technologies is by utilizing Rust, which is a very efficient programming language, we're able to create tools that work better, whereas things like ESLint and Prettier have suffered in the past. So Biome is definitely a contender to the scene. And then also even just looking at the config for Biome, it's like 10 lines. I think in some of my projects, my ESLint configuration extends over 100 lines. And so it's much easier and it provides sensible defaults that you can just get started with quickly. And at the end of the day, they're all useful because they provide VS Code plugins, and so it's really easy to integrate them into your code editor. So moving on, we have for things like UI styling, we have some component libraries. You've probably heard of Calcite. That's actually Esri's design system, and all this is providing is things like buttons, or avatars or checkboxes. It's providing a way for you to build UI without having to go into the fine-grained implementation of building a UI. Another pretty popular one is Redux UI. A big benefit of using something like Redux is that while Calcite is pretty prescribed in the look and feel, Redux provides a lot of extendability and lets you kind of customize your UI to fit your business needs, or if you already have a design system but need somewhere to get started, Redux is a really good place to get started with your own design system. Going even further, looking at configuring things like CSS for your UI, Tailwind CSS is a very popular library right now, self-described as a utility-first CSS framework, whatever that might mean. But essentially, let's actually look at an example to understand why it might be useful. So say we're trying to style this chit-chat message. And before Tailwind, our code would look a little bit something like this. You can see we have an HTML file that is calling all these CSS classes, and then on the left, we have this long list of CSS classes. And so maybe that's what you have now. And with Tailwind, you can actually do the same thing with this amount of code. And less is not always necessarily better, but there's just looking at the difference between these two, it's pretty evident that Tailwind is essentially just an easier way of writing CSS in line. And I think that's one of the most important pieces here is that with our example on the left side, you can see we have all these classes, chat notification logo wrapper. There's a disconnect between the actual CSS that's in place and the component, looking at the component itself. So if you want to see what the CSS is, you need to go to a new file. You need to locate this CSS class to figure out what is happening. Whereas with Tailwind, everything is happening in line. If you can see here, like we have things like h-12, which is essentially saying, give this a height of 12 pixels or 12 units. And it's the nice thing about Tailwind is everything is accessible by looking at it rather than having to refer to another file. This might mean you end up writing more. You might have these kind of unwieldy class names where you're adding all these different Tailwind operators. But really the benefit, though, is now if you need to look at the button and change the height, you don't have to context switch into a new file, find that CSS selector, and update it there. And so it makes just a very robust way of editing that in place. I also have some other tools that help with CSS or with Tailwind, and I'm not actually going to get too far into these, but the essential idea behind these tools is it makes it very easy to add things like variants. So if you've worked with Calcite, you can, or other component libraries, you usually have like a primary button and a secondary button, or a small button or a medium button. This is essentially just a declarative way of defining these variants pretty quickly. And that brings us to ShadCN UI, this is a really useful tool if you're developing your own component library. It's not actually a package or a library that you install. You literally just copy and paste from this website. And it sounds kind of silly, but it's actually pretty smart because it's giving you all the basic necessities for creating your own component library, and then you don't have to work through things like props or like APIs that the component library exposes. Everything that is available is right in front of you, and you can edit it in place.
That takes us to UI styling, and one of the things that you might want to do is adding motion to some of your websites. So Framer Motion is an easy way to add animations into React, and it's a simple declarative syntax to add those type of animations, allows things for additional events and advanced things that React normally doesn't hook into, like dragging and swiping components when you move them around. As you can see here, you can wrap the image there in a animate presence, and the key takeaways from this is there's an initial kind of representation there, and then there's also a animate and exit state. And as you can see, you can easily animate a image carousel and have it animate smoothly.
The next tool up is Zustand, and this is a React state management library. And this is actually when you talk to someone about Svelte, they'll probably just say that Svelte has this kind of functionality built in out of the box, whereas React can kind of struggle from not having some of this as standardized APIs. So again, we'll kind of briefly look at it. Essentially, all this is a centralized place that we can store our state within our application. If you've tried to do something like this before, you've probably heard of Redux or used Redux. And Zustand is essentially just a kind of a competitor to Redux, but it really tries to reduce the amount of boilerplate that you need to add to your application. So in this case, we're keeping track of the number of bearers, and you can increase the population, you can remove all, you can update, and then you can actually hook that directly into your React applications, and that's it. And now you have shared state between components. So definitely, if you're working in React, it's worth checking out. And you can get much more complex with your state management as well. So it really is just an easy tool to get started with. Yeah, so rapid fire, we now have TanStack Query. This is another kind of state management library, but focused on managing query and data fetching. So maybe this is a component that you have just using vanilla React state management. And it looks like this. This is a lot of kind of overhead that we're adding because most of the time when we have data fetching in our app, we're doing it in multiple places. And this is a lot of overhead that TanStack Query is able to kind of reduce. It takes care of a lot of the things like if data is pending, if data needs to be refetched, if there was an error. It's a really nice way of hooking your fetching into your React application. And then you can also see here, it's purely just also helping us reduce some of the overhead in the fetching logic that we need to add.
Next up, I want to talk about Zod for schema validation. It's a fast type safety check. It's a TypeScript first schema declaration and validation library, so you can declare a schema and then validate against it. It's concise and it has a chainable interface. As you can see here, there's a very simple example where we have created a schema. The schema in this case exists of a single string, and then we have tried to validate against the string tuna, which obviously works, but then when we try to parse a 12, then it throws a Zod error. And so if you're not if you're not sure why this might be helpful, a very real use case that we've used on projects is when you're working with something like a feature layer and you're fetching data. When you fetch that data, TypeScript is completely unaware of what any of the types are. And so where Zod comes into play is we can actually kind of define the same schema in our code, and then this actually gives us type safety on any of these pieces of data that we're fetching. So now we can actually, now instead of having like a type any on these objects, we actually have the type validated at runtime. And so this is also just a nice way for us to validate that data is being fetched correctly at runtime, and just kind of another safety net for our applications. So next we're going to quickly look at the standardized International Web API. We'll just kind of look at a couple of interesting examples. This is essentially just a way to format dates with ranges. And so this is, I guess the gist of this example is down here at the bottom. You can actually provide two dates that are in complete unique date formats. And this API is actually able to kind of determine, since these dates are on the same day,
this range should just be formatted by the time, whereas if they're on different days, it's gonna show the entire range of the date as well as the time. So it's kind of small useful things like that. Another kind of useful thing is this range for just formatting any type of number. So we have an example here of formatting USD. And you can see when we format a range of $3 to $5, it comes out looking like this. And actually kind of a cool functionality is that if you have values that round to the same value, it will actually just say, or it will respond with around $3, which kind of feels like something that should be easy enough, but it's a very, once you start getting into it and all the edge cases, it's nice to have something like this that can just standardize that functionality for us.
Next, just talking about testing, unit testing, there's Vite test. It supports ES modules is the key takeaway there, and TypeScript out of the box, and it integrates with Vite with minimal configuration. And so as you can see here, it's really simple to set up a test there, and setting up a sum and then testing it out and return the value.
And if you've worked with unit testing in the browser before, you might be familiar with Jest. And Jest can do the same kind of thing, but with a lot more configuration. Vitest really tries to be just an immediately kind of install and have the ability to run. So it's really nice just to quickly get started with it. This is a really cool tool that's been getting more popular recently is Playwright. If you've used Cypress, I think, it's basically, this tool is for end-to-end testing. And essentially what that means is testing some of the workflows in our application. So this code is actually corresponding to a series of actions that you're taking on your application. And one of the cool things about Playwright is you can go into this interactive mode and actually kind of just start clicking on things. And then as you're doing that, you can maybe get to a state in your application where you want to assert that the word to-dos is on the screen. And so this is just a really easy way of setting up these tests that will actually run through some of the existing workflows that you have. And it's just a really easy way to validate those workflows. So, and it provides just a ton of good developer experience type things, such as being able to record the tests. It also will provide a UI for actually watching the tests. And then it actually does install Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit to test on each of the browsers. So it's a really easy way to verify your application works across browsers.
Next, just talking about security vulnerability scanning, we recommend taking a look at GitHub CodeQL. It's automated scanning software for package vulnerabilities, code quality, and security exploits. As you can see, you can integrate it into a CI/CD workflow and make sure that your code is secure. This example finds an issue where there is not proper stringing escaping, and so there could be a possible attack vector there. So it has failed because of that security problem.
Yeah, and so that's kind of a good good collection of tools for our tool belt. And then we also kind of just have a few other resources that are good to know.
So State of the JS is a common survey that is done every year. They haven't released the 2023 yet, but the 2022 is out. It's helpful to take a look at that and see what type of web development trends are out there. It's very helpful for figuring out the newest and latest. As you can see, this is a chart of some of the frameworks and their usage over time. I think this one is retention, so how often and how much a framework is used.
Yeah, and then we have developer roadmaps, which is just a really good resource for even if you're a new developer or you're a seasoned developer and kind of don't know where to go next. These are essentially kind of community-built roadmaps of maybe here are some of the technologies you might want to start being familiar with. And so it's really useful, especially for newer developers, or if you're working in a new area, they have roadmaps for anything from front-end engineering to back-end engineering to even, I think, prompt generation with AI. So they really just try to lay out a solid framework of here are the things you should learn and in what order.
Next, we just want to recommend, make sure to check out developers, arcgis.com. It's a go-to for all ArcGIS developer content. So make sure that you're familiar with that site. There's just so much documentation and helpful examples there, whether you're coding in security into your web app or just trying to implement a UI. It's a great place to get started with anything ArcGIS related.
Yeah, and then finally, you probably already know about this resource if you've done any web development. But Mozilla provides really good documentation. They also have things like blogs, and then they also will just kind of highlight some of the new standardized web APIs. So that's just a very invaluable resource. More recently, they've also been kind of starting a curriculum type learning approach to help you kind of understand where to get started, or even if you just need to know where to go to next, MDN provides some pretty good resources. So with that, we want to open it up to any questions about any of the tools or recommendations, or if you completely disagree with any of the tools that we recommended, we would love to hear from you. So if you want to, you can come up to these microphones. Yeah.
Cool. I don't think I noticed it on the list of Vite templates, and I don't think you guys discussed it, but I don't think I saw Angular on the list. Is that just dead in 2024? Or should that just be considered harmful? Is it out of the running?
I don't think it can be dead because I think a lot of companies have heavily invested in it and are still using it. And I think the reason it's not there is I think there's enough in the other frameworks that people would recommend using one of the other frameworks. I think Angular doesn't always get the same treatment. I don't know if that's even a preferential thing by the Vite team, but I think more and more people are moving to React and Vue and Svelte, and I think Angular can kind of be left in an afterthought. But there definitely are many systems still built using Angular. I think it's just kind of being pushed out the door in a sense. So
just no new ones kind of thing. Okay, yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you. Thank
you. I was doing a little Googling back there, and I didn't see this, but do you know if there's any utilities for converting to PNPM if you already have a set of NPM projects that would do that sort of mapping for you?
Yeah, I mean, so PNPM can actually just plug and play with an NPM project. So, I mean, unless you're using maybe, are you talking about like workspaces or
I'm just saying if you have a set of repositories that are all installed using NPMs, they all have their individual folders of content. That would sort of, I think what you're saying is PNPM, the idea is that it has one centralized location for all these assets that are referenced in the different projects. Is that right?
Sure, yeah. So the question was if PNPM is using a localized kind of repository of local assets, how can you kind of integrate that with existing projects? And basically, the first time you use PNPM and initialize it in a project, it's just starting to build that repository. So the more projects you're adding it to, it's adding those to the local kind of centralized repository. And so that's all through just some local cache that PNPM has set up. So it should just kind of automatically start working. It might see it already has a package there. It doesn't need to replace it. So it should just kind of, you should be able to use any NPM projects you have now and start using PNPM in place.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've read a lot of angry things on the internet about Tailwind.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what your opinion or thoughts on other like CSS and JS modules like
style
components or emotion or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my my opinions differ. I think that's definitely that is a point of contention. A lot of people like using the CSS and JS because you can even have some type safety on that, or it's just a very easy way to create components with just the styling, whereas Tailwind is kind of the alternative of we're including all of the styling in line in each of these components. I think my personal opinion, I've used both, and the thing about Tailwind is just the fact that everything is so in line. Like styled components still kind of suffer from that. You know that this is a class you created somewhere. You have to actually go back and find that component. And the fact that most frameworks now are already very component based, like adding all of that CSS in line through Tailwind just makes it so much easier to reference each individual piece without having to kind of make that mapping between the two. So, but that being said, I think styled components still have a lot of value, and it's just kind of whatever works best for your organization method. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
With that, we're out of time for the day, but we'd love to talk to you after and take any questions and discuss things. Thanks for coming to the presentation, and hope you have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you.